The first snow began to fall as David's car crunched up the long gravel drive, the flakes catching in the beams of the headlights like a static-filled curtain. The family's lakeside cabin wasn't just remote. It felt like a world deliberately forgotten, tucked away at the end of a private lane that the county plows consistently ignored. This annual pre-Christmas pilgrimage with his father, Robert, was a quiet tradition. A week of masculine silence broken only by the crackle of the fireplace, the scratch of paperback pages, and the occasional strategic move in a chess game. This year, the silence felt heavier, more absolute, as if the fresh snow wasn't just covering the ground but was actively smothering any sound from the distant world. They arrived to a deep freeze. The key turned with difficulty in the lock, and the interior air was so cold it felt solid, smelling of pine sap and dust. The ritual of reanimation began. Robert, methodical and practiced, bleeding the pipes, coaxing the ancient oil furnace to life with a series of percussive knocks, while David unpacked the groceries, placing each can and box in the exact same cupboard it had occupied for 20 years. Their movements were familiar, a dance performed in near-total quiet, punctuated only by necessary phrases like "the water's on" or "fuse box is clear." David felt the predictable, comfortable emptiness of the place settle around him. It was a blank slate, a clean, cold page before the chaos of the full family arrived for Christmas Eve. He spent that first evening in his old room, the one with the wooden duck decoys on the shelf, playing video games on a console that felt like a relic, the glow of the screen his only real light. The storm outside intensified, a lashing, howling thing that rattled the window frames. He fell asleep to its roar, thinking of nothing more sinister than the impending drive to collect his mother and sister from the train station in a few days' time. The world outside, when he awoke, had been transformed into a pristine, blinding sculpture. 2 feet of perfect, unbroken snow draped every surface, bending the pine boughs low, burying the outdoor furniture, and smoothing the landscape into a series of soft, blue-shadowed curves. It was a postcard of winter isolation. The silence was now profound, the kind that presses against the eardrums. Over a breakfast of scrambled eggs and strong coffee, his father, gazing out the kitchen window over the rim of his mug, asked the question with casual curiosity. "When did you find the time to build that?" David followed his gaze. There, in the exact center of the vast white expanse of the backyard, stood a snowman. It was meticulously crafted, its 3 spheres perfectly proportioned and stacked with care. It faced the house directly. 2 long, thin sticks protruded from its midsection, not hanging limply but angled sharply upward as if in a frozen, simultaneous wave and ward. Most chilling were the facial features. Not the traditional coal lumps, but deep, precise gouges in the snow, 2 crescent-shaped eyes and a wide, upturned smile that seemed carved with a tool. The smile was too wide, the eyes too knowing. A coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature seeped into David's gut. "I didn't," he said, his voice flat. Robert shrugged, the gesture dismissing the universe's minor mysteries. "Must have been the Carson kids from down the road. Got bored after the storm. It's a bit odd, though, them coming all the way up here." The explanation was logical, and David clung to it, forcing a laugh. Yeah, weird sense of humor. But for the rest of the day, he found himself drawn to the window, glancing out at the solitary figure. The cheerful smile began to look less like mirth and more like a rictus grin, a permanent mask of mockery. As dusk fell, painting the snow deep blue, the snowman seemed to grow more distinct, a stark black and white sentinel against the twilight. He closed the blinds early that night. The thump that woke him was not the soft, sliding collapse of snow from the roof. It was a hard, deliberate, singular impact against the glass of his bedroom window, a knock from the frozen night. His eyes snapped open in the pitch blackness, his heart immediately hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He lay paralyzed, the warm cocoon of his bed now feeling like a trap. 5 minutes passed, each one stretching into an eternity, measured only by the pounding in his chest. The rational part of his brain, the part that had accepted the neighbor kid theory, staged a feeble coup. A heavy clump of ice. A branch. Nothing more. Gripped by a need to know that overrode his terror, he slowly peeled back the duvet. The floorboards were icy under his bare feet as he crept to the window. He took a breath, gripped the edge of the blind, and tilted a single slat. The moon, bright and gibbous, reflected off the snow, illuminating the scene with a clinical, silver light. Directly outside his window, so close he could have touched it through the glass, stood a second snowman. This one was smaller, cruder, as if built in haste or with violent energy. The stick arms were akimbo, and its face held not a smile, but a deep, slashing frown, the gouges in the snow so severe they seemed angry. It wasn't looking out at the woods. It was looking directly in, as if it had been waiting for him to appear. A raw, involuntary scream ripped from David's throat. He stumbled back from the window, shouting for his father. Robert arrived, breathless, a baseball bat in hand. A detail David would later recall with a shudder. This time, there were no shrugs, no talk of neighbors. In the beam of a flashlight, Robert's face was grim, etched with a paternal fear that was more terrifying to David than the sculpture itself. "My room," David managed to say, his voice trembling. Tonight, he didn't sleep. He lay on the spare bed in his sister's floral-scented room, staring at the ceiling, seeing only that furious frozen face. The next morning, under a cheerfully bright sun that felt like a cosmic joke, Robert marched down the road to the Carson house. David watched from the living room window. He saw his father knock, wait, peer through a side window, knock again. His posture, initially determined, slowly deflated. He returned 10 minutes later, stamping snow off his boots. "No one's there," he said, his voice low. "No cars. Chimneys cold. Mails piled up. They're gone for the holidays. Probably left before the storm even hit." The last thread of a logical explanation snapped. The ensuing days were a tense exercise in normalcy. They avoided the back of the house. They locked doors they never usually locked. The cheerful snowman in the yard was no longer a prank. It was a landmark, a flag planted by an unknown entity. The frowning one outside David's window had melted slightly in the sun, its features blurring into a grotesque, weeping mask, which was somehow worse. Then, the cavalry arrived. His mother, sister, grandparents, filling the cabin with overlapping chatter, the smell of baking cookies, and the blare of holiday music. The fear receded, diluted by noise and light and familiar presence. On Christmas Eve, the cabin was warm, bustling, a fortress against the silent, white world outside. They were in the living room, wrapped in the glow of the tree lights, a scene from a catalog. That's when the knocking came. Not the sharp rap of the second night, but a heavy, insistent thud, thud, thud on the thick front door. The room fell silent. The music seemed to hiccup. It was a sound that didn't belong, a rotten note in the carol. Robert stood up, holding a hand out to quiet everyone. "Who is it?" he called, his voice firm but with a tremor underneath. The voice that answered was thin, strained, muffled by the heavy wood. "Please, please let me in. It's so cold. I have nowhere to go. No one for the holidays." It was a man's voice, cracked with what sounded like genuine despair. David's mother moved toward the door, her face etched with sympathy, but Robert stopped her with a sharp look. The fear was back in his eyes, cold and bright. "You need to leave," Robert boomed, putting his full weight against the door. "I'm calling the police right now." There was a long pause. Then, the voice, softer now, defeated. Okay, I'll go. Please, don't call." They listened to the crunch of footsteps retreating through the snow, a slow, dragging sound that faded into nothing. No one spoke. The Christmas spirit had been sucked from the room, replaced by a deep, communal dread. The connection was made, unspoken but absolute. The snowmen and this lonely, desperate voice were threads of the same sinister fabric. Christmas morning dawned clear and painfully bright. The gifts were exchanged, but the ritual was hollow, performed with nervous smiles and ears straining for any sound from outside. It was David who saw it first when he went to fetch more firewood. A single, small square of white paper, taped at eye level to the front door. His hands were numb as he peeled it off. The handwriting was spidery, erratic, the pen having dug deeply into the paper. It read, "I just wanted to play. I made the snowmen for the boy. I watch him. I have no one. I am so alone. I'm sorry." He read it twice, the words not computing, then handed it silently to his father. Robert's face paled. The apology was the worst part. It implied a twisted self-awareness, a knowledge that his actions were wrong but an inability to stop them. It wasn't a threat. It was a confession of a broken, obsessive need. That day, they packed in a frantic, quiet rush, cutting their holiday short. As David loaded the car, he took one last look at the backyard. The cheerful snowman had partially collapsed, one stick arm pointing down into the slush. The woods at the edge of the property line stood dark and thick. For a moment, he thought he saw a shift in the shadows, a deeper blackness detaching itself from a tree trunk and melting back into the forest. He blinked, and it was gone. He knew, with a certainty that would follow him for years, that the author of the note wasn't gone. He was just waiting for the silence to return, for the blank, white page of the landscape to be presented to him once more, ready for his next frozen, lonely masterpiece. To continue, Part 2 would expand the Miami nightmare, delving deep into the neon-drenched chaos of the club, the visceral terror of the kidnapping, and the lingering psychological trauma. Part 3 would expand The Voice in the Woods, exploring the family's history with the land, the uncanny horror of the mimicry, and the aftermath of that violation. By developing characters, settings, internal monologues, and sensory details in this manner for each story, you can build your narrative to the desired length while maintaining suspense and readability. For Andre and Nico, Christmas had always been a symphony of familiar textures. The scratch of wool sweaters, the scent of pine needles thawing in the living room heat, the taste of their mother's coquito with a hint of too much rum. This year, their uncle's offer of a holiday in Miami was a thrilling rupture from tradition, a chance to trade gray Connecticut skies for the relentless, bleaching Florida sun. The disconnect was immediate and jarring. Palm trees strung with lights looked like costumed aliens, and the humid, 80-degree air on Christmas Eve felt like a physiological joke. Their family's rented condo in a towering, glass-faced building overlooked Biscayne Bay, a view that felt more like a postcard than a reality. The warmth was supposed to be a gift, but to Andre, it felt oppressive, a weight that left him perpetually slick with a thin film of sweat. Nico, however, 18 and vibrating with restless energy, absorbed it like a catalyst. He was the adventurer, the one who saw life as a series of doors to be pushed open, while Andre, at 21, was the cautious observer who checked the hinges first. The plan for a festive night out was Nico's, born from scrolling through glittering event pages promising sleigh bell soirees and naughty and nice pool parties. Andre agreed, less from desire and more from a protective older brother instinct he couldn't articulate. He told himself he was there to ensure Nico's fake ID worked, to be a moderating influence. As they dressed, Nico in a tight, black shirt that smelled of borrowed cologne, Andre in something more subdued, the normalcy of pre-gaming in their uncle's pristine kitchen felt like the last act of a familiar play before the curtain rose on a strange and unknown stage. The club was a pulsating organism of synthetic joy. The Christmas theme was a thin veneer slapped over the usual machinery of nightlife. A plastic Santa in the corner, bartenders in cheap felt hats, a bass-heavy remix of a classic carol thumping through speakers that made their sternums rattle. It was less a celebration and more a costume party for desperation. Andre felt out of phase with it all, sipping an overpriced beer and watching the human spectacle. Nico, however, came alive in the strobe light, his confidence blooming under the anonymous gaze of the crowd. That's when she materialized. Andre didn't see her approach. She simply appeared at Nico's elbow, a woman in her 40s with a smile that was all bright, calculated precision. Her sexy Mrs. Claus sweater was more of a slogan than a garment, and her blue Santa hat was tipped at a jaunty, ironic angle. Andre watched from 2 stools away as the dance of predation began. He saw her lean in, her hand resting on Nico's forearm, her laughter at his jokes a beat too loud. He heard snippets. "I just love an accent." And "Yo." And "Young men have such energy." Nico, flushed with the triumph of adult attention, beamed. Andre's internal alarms, finely tuned from a lifetime of older brotherhood, blared a low, steady warning. This wasn't flirtation. It was procurement. He caught Nico's eye and offered a subtle, questioning raise of his brow. Nico responded with a dismissive, gleaming smile and a slight shake of his head. "I've got this." When Nico finally clapped him on the shoulder, shouting over the music that he was heading out with her, Andre's protest died in his throat. It was swallowed by the booming bass and the resigned thought that perhaps he was just being a buzzkill, projecting his own discomfort onto his brother's good fortune. He watched them disappear into the crowd, the woman's blue hat bobbing like a buoy on a dark sea, and ordered another drink, trying to dilute his unease. The transition from the club's humid roar to the sterile, air-conditioned silence of his Uber was jarring. Andre stared out at the neon-washed streets, the festive lights now looking like arterial streaks against the night. His phone, face down on his leg, vibrated with a visceral shock. Nico's name flashed on the screen. Relief first, he was checking in, then immediate ice-water confusion. The call connected to a void. Not silence, but a dense, swallowing static, the sound of electronic emptiness. Then, within that void, a deep, guttural voice, not Nico's, uttering a single muffled word he couldn't decipher. A sharp yell, the sound of struggle, cut through the static before the line went dead. Andre's heart didn't race. It seemed to stop, to become a cold, hard stone in his chest. He called back. Once, twice, 5 times. On the 6th, it rang and was answered. "Yeah." The voice was a coarse gravel, aged by smoke and something darker. "Who is this?" Andre demanded, his own voice tight. "Found this phone on the sidewalk, pal," the man grunted. Andre's mind spun, constructing a fragile, hopeful narrative. Nico dropped it. "A stranger found it. Can you meet me? I can give you cash. Just tell me where." His plea was severed by a sound that pierced through the receiver and directly into his primal brain. It was Nico, distant but unmistakable, screaming his name. Not Andre, but his childhood nickname, Dre. "Help!" Before the scream was cut short with a wet, choking finality. The line went dead again. The world inside the Uber telescoped. The driver's eyes found his in the rearview mirror, wide with shared alarm. "You okay, man?" Andre couldn't speak. He pointed a trembling finger forward. "Pull over. Now, I need to call the police." What followed was a blur of fractured, hyper-real moments. The cold feel of the police cruiser's hood under his sweating palms as he gave a statement. The unbearable, slow-motion walk back into the condo to wake his parents, their faces shifting from sleep-soft confusion to abject horror. The frantic, useless calls to every hospital in the county. The return to the club with a stone-faced detective. The security footage showing Nico leaving with the woman, her arm linked possessively through his face eager and smiling. She looked directly at a camera with a bland, unconcerned expression as she led him out a side exit into an unmonitored alley. She was a professional. Then, the miracle that felt like a second trauma. His phone buzzing with an unknown area code. Nico's voice was a ragged, wheezing thing, layered with panic and pain. "Dre, they took me a car. I got out. I'm on a street. I don't know where." He was a wounded animal describing its trap. The GPS coordinates from the stranger's phone he'd borrowed led them to a desolate service road in North Miami, littered with industrial debris and shimmering with broken glass under the police chopper spotlight. Finding Nico was like finding a broken doll. One eye was swollen completely shut, a grotesque purple blossom. The other held a vacancy that was worse than pain. His lip was split, his clothes torn and stained. He flinched from the touch of the paramedics. In the sterile safety of the ER, the story spilled out in gasped fragments. The Uber was a sedan with 2 men already inside. The woman's smile vanished the second the door closed, replaced by a cold, transactional blankness. They had a gun. They took his wallet, his phone, his watch. One of them, the one with the gravel voice, had called Andre's number, holding the phone to Nico's bleeding face. "Make a sound, and we paint the roof with your brother's brains," he'd hissed. Nico's scream had been a desperate, calculated gamble for a witness. The beating was the price. They'd driven for an eternity, discussing the drop and the marsh in casual terms. Nico was sure, with a cellular-level certainty, that he was being taken to a shallow grave in the Everglades, to become another tourist who partied too hard and disappeared. His escape was not heroic, but a feral, last-chance convulsion when the car slowed at a dim intersection. He'd thrown his body against the door, stumbled into the night, and just run, the sound of the car's engine fading away behind him, as if they couldn't be bothered with a chase for damaged goods. Back at the condo, Christmas Day was a ghost of itself. Presents sat unopened. The traditional feast was picked at in silence. Every creak of the building's infrastructure was a footstep. Every raised voice from the pool deck was a threat. The police had no leads. The woman was a phantom. The men were ghosts. The case would grow cold, filed away with 100 others. The physical wounds on Nico's face began their slow, yellowing journey toward healing. The psychological ones festered. That night, Andre was ripped from sleep by a sound he'd never heard before. A raw, guttural shriek of pure terror from Nico's room. He found his brother sitting bolt upright in bed, drenched in sweat, staring at a blank corner of the wall. "She's in the house," Nico whispered, his voice trembling. "I saw her, in the hall. She was just smiling." Andre checked every closet, under every bed, the balcony, his own pulse hammering. There was no one, but as he sat on the edge of Nico's bed in the dark, the humid Miami air pressing in through the window, he understood. She was in the house. She was in the fragile silence, in the way Nico jumped at slamming car doors, in the permanent shadow behind his brother's eyes. The festive lights of Miami twinkled mockingly outside, a galaxy of cold, distant stars. The most dangerous predators, Andre realized, don't lurk in shadowy woods. They hunt in the bright, buzzing places, wearing smiles as their camouflage, and the traps they spring never truly release you. You carry the jaws with you, forever waiting for them to snap shut again in the dark. For Chase and Leo, the house was more than timber and plaster. It was a shared dream, hammered into reality with their own sweat and bank loans. Nestled on a wooded acre at the dead end of a country lane, it represented a hard-won independence from their suburban upbringing. That first Christmas was to be its christening, a ritual to banish the smell of fresh paint and sawdust with the richer sense of pine, roasting meat, and family. They decorated with deliberate nostalgia, hanging their mother's antique glass baubles on a fragrant fur, each ornament a tiny vessel of memory. The gathering was intimate. Their parents, their aunt and uncle, their sister Mara, her husband Ben, and their 2 young nephews, whose energy transformed the quiet spaces into arenas of gleeful chaos. The boys brought their dog, Mika, a shaggy mutt of boundless affection who immediately claimed the hearthrug as his throne. As dusk fell on Christmas Day, the house glowed from within, a lantern of warmth against the deepening cobalt of the winter evening. It was, Chase thought, a perfect tableau. He felt a profound, settled contentment, a feeling that this was the first page of a new and welcome story. This deep sense of sanctuary, however, made the violation that followed so much more profound, as if the darkness had not merely approached, but had been invited in, shown where the silverware was kept, and then decided to stay. The crack in the veneer appeared during dinner. Ben, a news editor with a tactless fascination for the macabre, brought up the recent headlines over pie. "You hear they found another one? Out in the state forest past Mill Creek," he said, tapping his fork. "Third hiker this autumn. They're saying the patterns are all wrong, not animal, not normal." A heavy silence descended. Mara shot him a withering look. "Not at the table, Ben. The kids." The subject was dropped, hastily buried under a landslide of talk about sports and movies. But the seed was planted. Chase, clearing plates later, caught Leo's eye. They'd grown up exploring those woods. A shared, unspoken thought passed between them. Our woods. The feeling was less fear and more a proprietary unease, as if their new home had been subtly linked to a spreading stain on a map. The evening wound down in a warm, wine-softened haze. Family left with hugs and taillights flashing down the drive. Mara, Ben, and the kids settled into the guest room and the pull-out couch. Chase's girlfriend, Sarah, arrived late, bringing the cold night in on her coat before shedding it for his embrace. When the last light was switched off, the house creaked its way into nocturnal silence, a complex organism settling to sleep. This silence was the canvas upon which the horror would soon be painted. Chase was plunged from the depths of sleep by Sarah's insistent grip on his shoulder. The digital clock burned 2:17 a.m. into the darkness. "Chase, listen," she whispered, her voice wire-tight. He heard it then, a low, rumbling vibration that was utterly alien in the sleeping house. It was Mika, but not the happy dog of the day. This was a primordial sound, a continuous, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the very floorboards of the hallway. It was the sound of a line being drawn. Throwing on a robe, Chase stepped out of the bedroom. The hallway was pitch black, but he felt the change in the atmosphere immediately. A sharp, crystalline coldness cutting through the central heat. Mika was a tense silhouette at the far end, standing stiff-legged, facing the back of the house. The growl never stopped. Chase flipped the light switch. The sight that greeted him halted his breath. The rear door, a solid slab of oak they always deadbolt, was standing wide open. An oblong of inky night framed by the doorway. A pool of freezing air was pouring in, making the curtains dance. On the pale wooden floor, leading from the threshold into the kitchen, were a half-dozen distinct, wet footprints. They were large, made by heavy boots, and dusted with melting snow. Before panic could fully take root, the voice came. It called his name from the absolute blackness beyond the door. "Kayres." It was Leo's voice. There was no mistaking it. The particular timbre, the slight upward inflection at the end. But it was wrong. It was strained, thin, stretched taut with a distress that was both pleading and somehow hollow, like a recording played at the wrong speed. "Leo?" Chase called back, stepping toward the door. The voice came again, fainter, as if moving away. "Chase, out here." It was pulled into the wind. Every instinct told him his brother was hurt, disoriented, maybe sleepwalking and in danger. The recent news headlines flashed, neon bright, in his mind. He didn't wake the others. This felt urgent, personal. He pulled on his boots and a heavy parka over his pajamas, grabbed the high-powered flashlight from the mudroom shelf, and stepped into the jaws of the night. The cold was a physical slap. His beam cut a swaying tunnel through the darkness, illuminating the deck, then the ragged lawn that bled into the tree line. The footprints were there, pressed into the inch of fresh powder, leading straight toward the woods. He followed, calling out, "Leo, I'm here. Where are you?" The reply was immediate, still his brother's voice, but now from deeper within the thick pines. "Here. Chase." He plunged into the forest. The world changed. The comforting light from the house vanished, swallowed by the dense lattice of branches. His flashlight beam became his entire universe, catching on gnarled roots, gleaming off ice-sheathed twigs, creating monstrous, dancing shadows. The footprints were clearer here, a betraying trail. He followed, his breath pluming in the frantic light. He called again. Again, the voice answered with just his name, a beacon in the dark. But a dissonance grew with every exchange. Leo was a practical man. If he was lost, he'd be yelling instructions, cursing, giving landmarks. This voice just called, a siren song with only one note. Chase's initial urgency began to curdle into a thick, primal dread. He stopped, panting. The footprints beside a fallen log. They were fading. Not being obscured by falling snow, but simply becoming less defined, as if the maker's weight had somehow lessened with each step. 20 yards later, they vanished entirely. The pristine snow stretched ahead, unmarked by any human passage. Yet the voice came again. Chase. It was from just ahead now, maybe 30 feet behind a thicket of brambles. It sounded closer, almost conversational. The sheer impossibility of it, the vanished tracks, the single-minded call, crystallized into a terror that froze his marrow. This was not his brother. Something was in these woods with him. Something that had walked out of his house and now wore his brother's voice like a skin. He fumbled for his phone, his numb fingers dialing Leo. It rang and rang in his ear, a mundane sound that screamed of the normal world just miles away. No answer. As the voicemail clicked, the woods fell into a total, suffocating silence. No wind, no rustle of animals. It was a vacuum, a held breath. Then, his phone buzzed, a violent shock in the stillness. Sarah's name. He answered, a desperate hope leaping. Her voice was a hissed scream. Chase, get back inside. Now. Leo is here. He's in his bed. He's asleep. Ben's on the couch. Everyone's accounted for. The words didn't compute at first. They were nonsense syllables. Then, their meaning detonated in his brain. The foundation of his reality shattered. He was not following a person. He was being lured. The thing in the woods knew his name, knew the voice that would draw him deeper, and it had been waiting for an open door. In that instant of horrific clarity, the silence broke. But not with a voice. It was a soft, shuffling crunch in the snow, off to his left. Then another, closer to his right. Not an echo. There was more than one. They had been listening, waiting for his moment of understanding. Chase didn't think. He spun and he ran. He crashed through low branches that lashed his face, stumbled over hidden roots, his flashlight beam jouncing madly, illuminating nightmare glimpses of tree trunks that seemed to lean in to block his path. He heard no pursuit, no footsteps behind him, and that was worse. It implied a confidence, a certainty that he was already in a maze from which there was no escape. He ran until a searing pain stabbed his side, until the welcome golden squares of his house windows suddenly glimmered through the trees like a mirage. He burst from the tree line, crossed the lawn in a staggering sprint, and fell through the open door, slamming it shut and throwing the deadbolt with a click that sounded like the closing of a tomb. He slid to the floor, gasping, his whole body shaking. The family, all awake, clustered around him in various states of undress and terror. Leo, bleary-eyed and bewildered, asked what was wrong. The story tumbled out of Chase in broken fragments. The door, the prints, the voice. As he described the voice, Leo's face went ashen. I was asleep, he kept repeating, a mantra of innocence. They called the police. A single, weary deputy came, took notes with an expression of profound skepticism, shone his flashlight around the now muddled backyard, and left with a promise to patrol. No explanation was possible. Nothing was stolen. The door's lock was undamaged. In the days and years that followed, the event became the family's dark folktale. The practical explanation was an intruder, a homeless person, a psychopath who fled. But it never sat right. The opened lock with no sign of forcing. The perfectly mimicked voice. The footprints that vanished into nothing. The feeling of being herded. Chase knew, in a place beyond logic, what he had felt in those woods. It was not human desperation, but a cold, ancient curiosity. It was the intelligence of the deep winter dark, a thing that knew the shapes of homes and the sounds of the voices inside, and which, on a long silent night, decided to knock. The house never quite lost its newness after that. It gained a history, a foundational crack. Chase would often stand at the kitchen window, staring at the tree line at dusk. He had brought a piece of the outer darkness back in with him, and it lived now in the corner of his eye, in the hesitation before he turned a light off, in the way he would sometimes, for no reason, call out his brother's name just to hear the real answer echo safely within their walls. The voice in the woods had taught him that the true horror of the holiday season isn't found in the ghost stories we tell, but in the silent, waiting truth that sometimes, the world outside knows your name, and all that keeps it from whispering through an open door is the fragile, spinning lock of chance.